Hey, if you're thinking, I barely have time to write, let alone start a podcast, I got you. My Start Your Author podcast checklist helps busy writers like you start a podcast without sacrificing your writing time. No more guessing or Googling. Starting is actually the easiest part of podcasting, and with this step-by-step checklist, you can fit it in over the next 6 weeks or even next weekend. Stop letting uncertainty hold you back. Grab your free checklist at the link below and get on your way to serving your target readers today. Welcome to Book Marketing Mania. I'm your host, Kim, and I'm so thrilled you're here to learn how to reach and serve your readers as a podcast host and guest. So tell me if this sounds familiar. You hear that podcasting is the way to go, so you start pitching yourself as a guest. Maybe you even start your own show. You do all the work to plan and pitch and record and promote your episode, yet you don't see the results you're hoping for. Maybe you look back on the podcasting journey as a host or guest and thought, wow, this episode I thought would have gotten more downloads. Or I thought more people would sign up for my newsletter after they hear this episode. Or I thought this episode would have brought way more collaborations between the two of us. Or I thought this episode would have sold more books. Well, sadly, just showing up behind the mic as a host or guest doesn't magically translate to a bigger platform, bigger email list, more book sales, or more downloads. Womp, womp. Here's the truth. Without clear goals for podcasting as an author and a way to measure them, you might as well be throwing spaghetti at the wall and praying something sticks. But I want you to go get them, GETM, with podcasting this year with the right goals, episodes, time, and money. So back on episodes 46 and 114, and I'll link those in the show notes, I shared lots of ways that podcasting as a host and guest can help grow your author platform. But what I found is that all of those really lead back to 4 main goals that we can measure. And that's number 1, serving content to attract and nurture your target readers. Number 2, growing your email list. Number 3, building relationships for future collaborations. And last but not least, number 4, selling books. So let's talk about each of these and how to measure if you're meeting these goals as both a host and guest. So number 1, serving content that attracts and nurtures your readers. Maybe you're podcasting as a host or guest to show agents and publishers that you're growing your platform of future readers to sell books to, and that you're currently reaching and serving those readers, and you have a plan to continue doing so throughout your book launch. Maybe you want to podcast your book. So instead of writing, you would rather just speak behind the mic as a host or guest. And then what you can do is turn your most popular episodes, whether that's as a host or guest, into chapters of your book. So I've started writing my first book this year, and I was blown away when I started pulling content from my podcast and putting that into my Word document for my book. And I was a third of the way through my target word count for the whole book just from what I have created on the podcast with myself and my guests. So I was super excited about that. And, maybe you're just wanting to flesh out your content of your book, like you flesh out your ideas for your book. You can do that again as a host or guest and just see how listeners respond before you move forward with, yes, this is what my book's going to be about. So if your goal is serving content that attracts and nurtures your readers, then as a podcast host, you want to measure your downloads. But not just the number of downloads. You want to look at how many people are actually listening to the whole episode and how many are following your show so it pops up in their players and they don't have to wait for you to tell them that you have a new episode out. because we can't serve and nurture readers if they're not even listening to our episode. And there's a difference between downloading of an episode and actually listening. And we're going to be talking about that in a future episode. And as a podcast guest, measuring this goal of downloads, well, it's a little trickier, right? Because you're relying on the host and the listeners to give you feedback on how great the episode was after it airs, unless you're also a podcast host and you're guesting to grow your own show. In that case, you can measure downloads and listens because you're attracting somebody else's listeners to your own show where you can continue to nurture them. Oh gosh, we're going to be talking about a lot about that this year because over the last 2 years, I've seen a minimum 40% increase in my downloads the month the episodes air of me as a guest. And I've seen them as high as a 92% increase when I had more than one episode air in the same month, where I was a guest on somebody else's show. So it was a super aligned audience that I was serving, and they naturally wanted to come over and check out my show and learn more about what I had to offer, right? Now, shame on me. I haven't been really focused on growing my email list, so let's talk about that as the second podcast goal and how to measure it. So, growing your email list. So, say you're creating content as a host or guest to attract and nurture your readers, but your goal you really want to measure is if you're actually growing your email list. Whether you're just starting to write your book or you have a shelf full of books to sell, we all know how important it is to be able to communicate back and forth with your readers through email and not be reliant on social media, algorithms, or Google to bring traffic to your website. So, as both the host and guest, after your episode airs, you can look to see if you have new subscribers to your email list. Now, this only works if the content of your episode aligns with your freebie, and we're going to talk about that in the next episode. And remember, podcasting is an evergreen strategy. So listeners might listen to your episode long after it airs, so email growth may just happen over time. In fact, when I was looking at my numbers, I realized 30% of my listeners are actually consuming episodes that were released throughout the last 3 years or the first 3 years of my show. Now, I know some hosts don't really mention your freebie, and they may not even link it in their podcast show notes. But there are ways you can bake that into your interview, and we're going to be talking about that soon as well. But also keep in mind, again, that if you host your own show and guest on podcast to grow it, then you can promote your email list as much as you want to. Just saying. Okay, before we get to goal number 3, are you already getting that nagging feeling that podcasting is going to eat away at your writing schedule? I know exactly how that feels now, so let's get rid of that for good. You can book a strategy session at the link provided here. It's a special listener rate, and I'll show you how you can host and guest on podcast to build your author platform without sacrificing your writing time. Now, the third podcast goal to measure is building relationships for future collaborations. Back on episode 42, I shared 7 ways to market your book through collaborations, and it's no secret, podcasting is my favorite way to collaborate and reach new readers on podcast. So with this goal, you want to measure the opportunities that come about between you as the host and your guest, or you as the guest and the host you're collaborating with. So as a podcast host, measure those opportunities that come about from having guests on your show. Did they reciprocate and invite you to share your message on theirs, if you're also a host? Maybe they invited you to speak at their online summit. Maybe they offered to share about your podcast or book in their newsletter. Maybe they recommended you as a guest to somebody in their network. And as a podcast guest, measure opportunities that come from shows you've guested on, where that's led. Maybe you swapped and you were on each other's shows and, you were able to help nurture your listeners or talk about your book on their show, right? Maybe it's led to them introducing you to somebody else in their network. Maybe it's led to an ongoing partnership. I know that happened with a couple of my clients. I introduced them to guests on each other's shows, and they created a mastermind together. That's super fun. Now, something I want podcast hosts to really think about here is if your goal of the episode with a guest is building relationships, or even you're building credibility for your show with this guest on there, then don't get too bummed out if you don't get a ton of downloads on that episode, because that wasn't the goal of it, right? The relationship was. And last but not least, goal number 4, selling books. So if your goal for hosting and guesting on podcasts is to sell books, then that's what you're going to measure. Now, keep in mind, like we've talked about, podcasting is evergreen. So you might not see book sales or movement on your book's Amazon ranking the day the episode airs, but you might see it over time. And keep in mind, as a guest, listeners might not buy your book right after your episode, right? They might get distracted. They might stop the episode before your call to action to even check out the book. But they'll be way more likely to pop over and listen to your own podcast where you can continue to sell your book to them. Just saying. Are you sensing a theme here? If you know, you know. So let's recap your 4 goals to measure to reach and serve your readers on podcast. That's number 1, serving content to attract and nurture your readers, and you're measuring your downloads and listens. Number 2, growing your email list and measuring your subscribers. Number 3, building relationships for future collaborations and then measuring the opportunities that come out of it. And number 4, last but not least, selling books and measuring your book sales. Now, if you're a podcast host with a book already, you're going to likely be measuring all of these goals on a monthly basis if you're using your podcast to market your book. But when it comes to each of your episodes, both as a host and guest, you probably have a specific goal in mind you are hoping to reach. So here's what I want you to do now. Look at your content calendar of upcoming episodes to be recorded, either as a guest or a host, and decide what is my goal I really want to get out of these. So as a host, I want this episode to really get a lot of downloads. As a host or guest, I want this episode to really get more email subscribers. Or I want this episode to really bring more collaborations. Or I want this episode to really sell some more books. And then stay tuned as we continue this series on how to go get them, GETM, with podcasting this year with the right goals, episodes, time, and money. In the next episode, we're going to talk about your episodes and the content you want to create to meet your goal as a host or guest. Because we don't want to be spinning our wheels and wasting time and money podcasting if it's not working. Let's make sure we're creating content that not only serves our target readers well, but it also helps us meet our author goals too. Thanks for tuning in today, and as always, I'll be there for you to help you reach and serve your readers one podcast at a time. See you next episode.